In the winter of 1849, Talbot County, Georgia, stood as a testament to how wealth could be built on the backs of human suffering. The Whitmore Estate stretched along the Flint River, its tobacco fields producing leaves so fine they fetched premium prices in Augusta and beyond. But prosperity has a way of blinding men to the rot festering beneath their polished boots. This is an account of how one man spent 20 years studying his captors, learning their patterns the way a hunter learns the habits of wolves. It's about patience so profound it could outlast seasons, and vengeance so precisely calibrated that when it finally arrived, it wore the face of mercy until the very last moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard Blackwell believed himself a righteous man. Every Sunday, he sat in the front pew of Preston Methodist Church, his leather Bible cracked from use, his voice rising above others during hymns about grace and salvation. He quoted scripture to justify the chains, cited Leviticus to explain the whip, and found divine sanction in every brutality he administered. His conviction was absolute. God had ordained a natural order, and he was merely its faithful steward. This certainty made him dangerous in ways that simple cruelty never could. A cruel man might hesitate, a righteous man never does. The tracking hounds lived in kennels behind the tobacco curing barns, 8 massive animals bred from bloodhound and mastiff stock. Their purpose was singular and terrible. When someone tried to claim their own life by running, these dogs would hunt them through the Georgia pine forests, their howls echoing like demons through the darkness. Richard had paid top dollar for each animal, considering them among his finest investments. They were fed well enough to maintain their strength, but kept hungry enough to maintain their drive. The balance was delicate, requiring someone with natural instinct for animal behavior. That someone was Jacob. Jacob had been born into this hell in 1829, delivered by his mother Leah in a cabin that leaked rain and offered no protection from winter cold. From his earliest memories, he understood that his life was not his own, that his body was property, that his future held nothing but endless labor punctuated by moments of acute terror. But Jacob possessed something his owners never suspected. Behind eyes trained to look downward in submission, behind a posture curved by years of forced deference, lived a mind of extraordinary capability. He forgot nothing. Every conversation overheard, every routine observed, every vulnerability noticed was catalogued with perfect clarity. At 10 years old, Jacob demonstrated an unusual connection with animals. He could calm nervous horses with a touch, predict when the barn cats would have kittens, and seemed to understand the moods of the plantation's various creatures through some intuition his owners found useful but fundamentally mysterious. When the kennel keeper died of fever in 1839, Richard Blackwell made a calculated decision. The boy would take over care of the tracking hounds. It was a position of unusual access and mobility. Jacob could move between the kennels, the main house, and various parts of the estate without constant supervision. This freedom was both privilege and curse, for it meant witnessing things other enslaved people were spared from seeing. The hounds became Jacob's constant companions. While their owners never bothered to name them, treating them as interchangeable tools of terror, Jacob gave each a name spoken only in whispers. There was Thunder, the massive male with the scarred muzzle who led the pack. Grace, the female whose howl could freeze your blood. Soldier, Judge, River, Storm, King, and Shadow. He learned their individual personalities, their preferences, their fears. He knew which one would attack most savagely and which could be called off most easily. This knowledge accumulated in his mind like ammunition stored for a war he knew would someday come. Richard's nephew Thomas arrived at the Whitmore Estate in 1845, sent by his father to learn the tobacco business and eventually inherit a share of the property. Where Richard was methodical and cold, Thomas burned with a different kind of darkness. He enjoyed the suffering. The screams meant something to him beyond mere discipline. He would invent infractions to justify punishments, would watch whippings with an expression approaching ecstasy. would volunteer to conduct night patrols, hoping to catch someone violating curfew. The enslaved community learned quickly that Thomas Blackwell was perhaps more dangerous than his uncle, because his cruelty had no logic, followed no rules, could erupt at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. Jacob watched Thomas carefully during those first months, cataloging his patterns. The young man was predictable in his unpredictability. He drank heavily most nights, became louder and more violent when drunk, and would sleep late the following mornings. He carried a pistol everywhere, touching it constantly, as if its presence reassured him of his power. He had a habit of walking the property line at dusk, checking fences and looking for signs of escape attempts. These observations meant nothing yet, but Jacob filed them away with everything else, building a mental map of vulnerabilities he might someday exploit. Life at the Whitmore Estate followed rhythms dictated by tobacco cultivation. Spring meant preparing seedbeds and transplanting delicate young plants into fields. Summer brought the backbreaking work of topping and suckering, removing flowers and side shoots so the leaves would grow large and valuable. Fall meant harvest, when everyone worked from dawn until well past dark, cutting stalks and hanging them in curing barns. Winter offered a brief respite, though there was always work, always some task that needed doing. The 28 enslaved people who worked these fields understood that rest was temporary, that spring would come again, that the cycle was eternal and inescapable. Punishments at the Whitmore Estate were conducted at the cedar post that stood in the center of the workyard. Unlike some plantations that used elaborate pillories or whipping posts, Richard Blackwell preferred simplicity. The post was 12 feet tall, weathered gray by sun and rain, stained dark at its base by blood that had seeped into the wood over decades. Hands were tied above the head, stretching the victim's body taut. Henry Porter, the overseer, who had replaced William Drake, administered the lashings with mechanical efficiency. He used a braided leather whip that left distinctive marks, parallel lines that would scar permanently. The number of lashes varied by offense, but 20 was standard for most infractions.
Everyone else. Richard believed that public discipline served a dual purpose. It punished the guilty and terrified the innocent. What Richard never understood was that every lashing, every scream, every drop of blood spilled in that yard was being recorded by at least one witness who would never forget, never forgive, and was simply waiting for the right moment to balance the scales. Jacob stood with the others, head bowed, face carefully neutral, while internally marking another debt in the ledger he kept in his mind. The transformation of Jacob's life from mere survival to calculated
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Began in the summer of 1847 with his sister Ruth. She was 19 years old, possessed of a gentle nature that somehow had survived intact despite growing up in captivity. Ruth worked in the main house as a domestic, responsible for cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and helping prepare meals. It was considered a privileged position compared to field work, but privilege is relative in hell. The house servants worked under constant scrutiny, had no privacy, and were vulnerable in ways that field workers were not. William Drake had been overseer of the Whitmore Estate for 8 years when Ruth caught his attention. Drake was 42 years old, married with children in Preston, and possessed of appetites that his wife either didn't satisfy or didn't know about. He had developed a pattern over his years as overseer, selecting young women from among the enslaved population and coercing them into providing what he called special services. The coercion was never physical at first. It didn't need to be. Drake had absolute power over these women's lives and the lives of everyone they loved. A word from him could send a mother to the fields, a brother to the whipping post, a child to the auction block. The threat was implicit, but absolutely real. Ruth tried to avoid Drake's attention for weeks. She would volunteer for tasks that took her away from areas where he might corner her alone. She stayed close to other house servants whenever possible. She developed a strategy of being perpetually busy, always moving, never giving him an opportunity to speak to her privately. But the Whitmore Estate was only so large, and Drake was patient and determined. One afternoon in late June, he found her alone in the laundry house, far enough from the main house that no one would hear if she called for help. The threat Drake made was specific and personal. He told Ruth that her brother Jacob had been getting too comfortable in his position with the Hounds. Drake said he'd noticed Jacob moving around with too much freedom, acting like he owned the place, needed to be reminded of his station. Drake could arrange for Jacob to be sold south, to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the life expectancy of a field hand was measured in years rather than decades. Or Ruth could be accommodating, could meet Drake in places and at times he specified could keep him happy and keep her brothers safe. The choice, he said with a smile that made her stomach turn, was entirely hers. Ruth submitted to the abuse to protect Jacob, never telling him what was happening, carrying the burden alone in a silence born of love and desperation. The encounters happened in various locations around the plantation, always away from the main house, always in places where discovery was unlikely. Drake preferred the small equipment shed near the tobacco barns, a structure that locked from inside and had no windows. Ruth would emerge from these encounters mechanically completing her remaining tasks for the day before returning to the slave quarters where she would wash herself compulsively, trying to scrub away something that couldn't be cleaned from the outside. Jacob noticed the changes in his sister before he understood their cause. Ruth had always been warm and talkative, finding small joys even in their constrained existence. She would sing while working, would make jokes that got the other house servants laughing, would share stories that helped everyone forget their circumstances for brief moments. But that summer, she became withdrawn and silent. Her eyes took on a haunted quality. She startled at sudden sounds and avoided physical contact, even from family. She stopped singing entirely. When Jacob tried to talk to her, tried to understand what had changed, Ruth would deflect or simply walk away, unable to burden him with the truth that would destroy him. The pregnancy became apparent by early fall. Ruth could no longer hide the changes in her body, and once the other house servants noticed, the news spread quickly through the entire enslaved community. No one spoke openly about the pregnancy's origin. Everyone knew that speculating about such matters could result in severe punishment for the entire community. Questions about paternity were dangerous because they implied accusations against white men, and such accusations were never tolerated, regardless of their truth. The silence was strategic, a form of collective self-preservation that the enslaved had perfected over generations of surviving the unsurvivable. Richard Blackwell's response to Ruth's pregnancy was entirely pragmatic. He saw no moral dimension to the situation, only a business calculation. A house servant was less efficient at her duties. The child, once born, would represent a future asset, but also an immediate complication. The father's identity, which Richard suspected but didn't care to confirm, was irrelevant to his decision-making process. The solution was obvious and profitable. Sell Ruth to another plantation before the pregnancy advanced too far. Get rid of the problem while extracting maximum value from the transaction. The sale was arranged with disturbing speed. Less than 1 week after Ruth's pregnancy became impossible to hide, a slave trader from Columbus arrived at the Whitmore Estate with documents already prepared. Ruth was examined like livestock, her teeth inspected for soundness, her muscles tested for strength, her pregnancy confirmed through humiliating physical examination conducted in front of strangers who discussed her body as if she were an animal being evaluated for breeding purposes. The agreed price was $750, which Richard considered satisfactory given the circumstances. The buyer represented a cotton plantation in Mississippi, a place so distant it might as well have been on the moon. Jacob learned about his sister's impending sale from another house servant who found him at the kennels. He ran to the main house yard where the trader's wagon was being loaded, arriving just in time to see Ruth being shackled alongside 3 other recently purchased slaves. Their eyes met across the yard for one final moment. Ruth's expression contained a complexity of emotions that would haunt Jacob for the rest of his life. Sorrow, fear, love, and something that looked almost like relief that at least Jacob was being spared whatever horrors awaited her.
Then the wagon was moving,
carrying Ruth down the long drive toward the main road, toward Mississippi, toward a fate Jacob could only imagine in his darkest moments. Something fundamental broke inside Jacob as he watched that wagon disappear. The careful control he had maintained over his emotions for 20 years shattered. The strategic patience he had been unconsciously cultivating suddenly found its purpose. Standing in that yard, watching his sister taken away forever because of a white man's appetite and another white man's greed, Jacob felt his consciousness shift. The boy who had learned to care for hounds became something else entirely. He became a man with a singular focus, a man who would wait as long as necessary, who would plan with absolute precision, who would ensure that the men responsible for destroying his family would pay a price proportionate to their crimes. Leah never recovered from losing her daughter. At 46 years old, she had endured more than most souls could bear and still remained standing. She had watched her husband sold away when Jacob was barely 5 years old, torn from their family because Richard Blackwell needed quick cash to expand his tobacco operations. She had survived the daily humiliations of enslavement, the constant fear, the back-breaking labor in the fields before age had moved her to lighter duties around the quarters. She had found ways to create moments of beauty in a world designed to crush beauty from existence. But Ruth's sale represented a wound too deep for healing. The decline happened gradually at first, then with terrible speed. Leah stopped eating properly, consuming only enough to keep her body functioning at the most basic level. She stopped participating in the quiet conversations that happened in the slave quarters after dark, those precious moments when the enslaved could speak freely among themselves. She stopped attending the secret prayer meetings held in the woods on Sunday evenings, gatherings where they could worship in their own way, rather than sitting silent in the back pews of Preston Methodist Church listening to sermons about obedience and submission. She simply withdrew into herself, as if her spirit had already departed and was merely waiting for her body to catch up. Jacob tried everything he could think of to pull his mother back from the edge. He brought her small gifts, a particularly beautiful stone from the river, wildflowers that bloomed near the tobacco barns, a carved wooden figure he'd made during his few spare moments. He sat with her in the evenings, talking about his day, sharing observations about the hounds, trying to spark some interest in the world around her. But Leah looked through him rather than at him, her gaze fixed on something beyond the physical realm, perhaps seeing Ruth somewhere in Mississippi, perhaps seeing nothing at all. The end came on a cold night in March 1848. Leah went to sleep in the cabin she shared with 3 other women and simply never woke up. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words of wisdom or comfort. She had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that she was done fighting. Her body, which had been forced to endure so much for so long, was granted permission to finally rest. Jacob found her the next morning when she didn't emerge for the dawn bell. Her face held an expression of profound peace that contrasted starkly with the pain that had marked her final months. The burial happened that same afternoon in the plot designated for enslaved people at the back of the Whitmore Estate property. It was a swampy area where the water table sat close to the surface, where nothing valuable could be grown, where the trees grew twisted and strange. More than 100 souls had been buried there over the decades the Blackwell family had owned this land. Most graves were marked with simple wooden crosses that rotted away after a few years. Some had stones with names scratched on them. Many had nothing at all. Their locations remembered only in the minds of those who had known them, and when those people died, even the memory of the grave's locations died with them. Henry Porter gave Jacob an hour away from his duties to attend his mother's burial, an hour to say goodbye to the woman who had given him life, who had protected him as much as any mother could in their circumstances, who had taught him to find dignity even in degradation. The other enslaved people gathered around the grave, offering what comfort they could through presence, if not words. Someone sang a spiritual in a voice that carried both sorrow and defiant hope. Someone else said a prayer that acknowledged their suffering while insisting that a better world awaited beyond this veil of tears. Then they covered Leah's body with the damp earth, and everyone returned to their duties because grief was not an acceptable excuse for reduced productivity. After his mother's burial, Jacob underwent a transformation that was visible only to those who knew him well. Outwardly, he maintained the same pattern of behavior he had always shown. He rose before dawn to feed and exercise the hounds. He cleaned their kennels with meticulous care. He prepared them for tracking duty when runaways were reported, though mercifully such incidents were rare at the Whitmore Estate compared to some plantations. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes downcast in the presence of white people, and performed every task with the mechanical efficiency that Richard Blackwell valued so highly. But internally, Jacob was building something. He began studying the plantation's rhythms with new intensity, not just observing, but analyzing. He noted when Richard met with buyers, when Thomas went into Preston for supplies, when Henry Porter made his rounds. He memorized the layout of every building on the property, every path through the woods, every weak point in the fencing that bordered the estate. He listened with absolute attention to every conversation he could overhear, filing away information about business dealings, family tensions, travel plans, financial pressures. The hounds became more than just animals under his care. They became instruments he was learning to play with the precision of a master musician. Jacob discovered that the hound's aggression could be controlled not just through training, but through subtle dietary manipulations. Feed them certain amounts at certain times, and they became more docile. Feed them differently, and their hunting drive intensified. He learned which verbal commands worked best with which animals, how to use tone and gesture to communicate complex instructions. He discovered that the hounds, despite their fearsome reputation, were capable of loyalty and affection towards someone who treated them consistently and fairly. Most importantly, Jacob learned patience of a kind that most people never develop. He understood instinctively that revenge executed in haste would be wrong-headed and ineffective.
Revenge that failed. He needed to wait for the perfect confluence of circumstances, the moment when all variables aligned in his favor. Rushing would mean mistakes, and mistakes would mean death, probably not just for him, but for others in the enslaved community who would be punished collectively for his individual action. So he waited and watched and prepared mentally for an opportunity he couldn't yet envision but trusted would eventually arrive. The opportunity to act against William Drake came in the fall of 1847, several months after Ruth's sale, but before Leah's death. Drake had continued his pattern of abuse with other young women on the plantation, seemingly untouchable, protected by the implicit understanding that overseers had certain privileges that came with their position. But Drake made a critical mistake. He began drinking heavily while on duty, compromising his judgment and making him careless about covering his tracks. Richard Blackwell noticed the decline in Drake's performance, the way certain tasks were left incomplete, the increasing complaints from field supervisors about contradictory orders. One October evening, Drake announced he was going hunting alone in the woods that bordered the Flint River. He did this occasionally, taking one of Richard's rifles and disappearing for a few hours to shoot rabbits or squirrels. On this particular evening, he was noticeably drunk when he departed, staggering slightly as he walked toward the tree line. Jacob, who happened to be exercising the hounds near the kennels, observed Drake's departure with interest. Something about the overseer's condition, the fading daylight, the isolated location Drake was heading toward, sparked a possibility in Jacob's mind. What happened in those woods was never fully documented. The official story, the one that satisfied the cursory investigation conducted by local authorities, was that William Drake tripped over a root in the failing light, fell badly, and struck his head on a rock. When his body was discovered the next morning by a search party, the head wound was consistent with this explanation. But there were other injuries that the official investigation glossed over or ignored.
There were marks on Drake's arms and legs that looked like they could have been made by animal teeth. There were signs that Drake had been conscious and struggling for some time before death. There were indications that his body had been moved after the initial injury. Jacob was never questioned about Drake's death. His presence at the kennels throughout the evening had been confirmed by multiple witnesses. The hounds had all been accounted for in their enclosures. There was no reason to suspect the quiet slave who cared for the tracking dogs of any involvement in a white overseer's accidental death. But those who knew Jacob well, who had watched him closely in the months since Ruth's sale, noticed something subtle change in his demeanor after Drake's body was found. There was a calmness about him, a sense of equilibrium restored, as if some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Henry Porter was hired as Drake's replacement within 2 weeks. Porter was a different kind of overseer, equally brutal when he deemed brutality necessary, but without Drake's personal sadism and appetite for sexual exploitation. He saw his role as a job requiring certain unpleasant tasks rather than as an opportunity to indulge his worst impulses. This made him marginally more tolerable than Drake, though tolerable is a relative term when discussing men who made their living enforcing slavery through violence and intimidation. Porter carried out Richard's orders efficiently, administered punishments without apparent pleasure or reluctance, and maintained the plantation's operations with competent professionalism. The 2 years following Drake's death and Leah's passing were years of careful observation and mental preparation for Jacob. He watched Richard Blackwell with the intensity of a scholar studying a complex text. The plantation owner followed predictable patterns. He rose at dawn, spent his mornings reviewing account books and planning the day's work, made inspection tours of the fields and facilities in the afternoon, and spent his evenings in the main house reading or entertaining occasional visitors from Preston or Augusta. Richard made an annual trip to Augusta each December to conduct business with tobacco buyers, a journey that took him away from the plantation for several days. Thomas Blackwell was equally predictable, but in different ways. The young man's routines revolved around his vices. He drank heavily most evenings, often becoming belligerent and looking for excuses to demonstrate his authority. He had a habit of walking the property boundaries at dusk, ostensibly checking for security issues, but really just burning off nervous energy. He slept late most mornings, hungover and irritable. His relationship with his uncle was complex, mixing genuine affection with rivalry and resentment. Thomas wanted to inherit a substantial portion of the Whitmore estate, but Richard had never formally committed to specific arrangements, keeping his nephew in a state of anxious uncertainty. Jacob also studied the physical layout of the estate with new attention to tactical detail. The road to Augusta ran through dense pine forest for the first several miles after leaving the plantation's main drive. There were sections where the trees grew so close to the road that the canopy overhead blocked most sunlight even at midday. There were places where ravines cut close to the path, where the forest floor was covered in thick underbrush that could conceal almost anything. There were spots where a person could position themselves with a clear view of the road while remaining completely invisible to travelers passing by. The Hounds' training continued under Jacob's supervision, but he began incorporating subtle changes that no one else noticed. He taught them to respond to hand signals in addition to verbal commands, creating a silent communication system. He discovered that certain whistles, pitched at frequencies barely audible to human ears, could control the dog's behavior from considerable distances. He learned exactly how much food to withhold before a tracking session to maximize their hunting drive, and conversely, how to feed them to temporarily reduce their aggression. This knowledge accumulated in his mind like weapons in an arsenal, waiting for the day when they would be needed. Daniel entered Jacob's life in the summer of 1849, though they had known each other peripherally for years. Daniel was 22 years old, a field worker whose body bore the scars of multiple whippings administered for various infractions, both real and imagined. His wife, Rose, had been sold away the previous year after refusing Drake's advances, sold to a plantation in Alabama for $800 that Richard used to purchase new tobacco processing equipment. The sale
Broken something in Daniel, transforming him from a man who tried to survive by following rules into someone who no longer cared about survival if survival meant continuing to accept injustice without resistance. The friendship between Jacob and Daniel developed slowly, built on mutual recognition of shared loss and shared rage. They spoke carefully at first, using coded language to discuss forbidden topics, testing each other's trustworthiness before revealing their true thoughts. Daniel had noticed things about Drake's death that others had missed or chosen not to mention. He had questions about the exact nature of Drake's injuries, about the convenient timing of the accident, about Jacob's peculiar calmness afterward. He never asked these questions directly, but his meaning was clear enough. By fall of 1849, Jacob and Daniel had developed a relationship that went beyond friendship into something like brotherhood. They understood each other's pain in ways that required no explanation. They shared a conviction that the system would never deliver justice through official channels, that redress could only come through actions taken outside the bounds of law and order. They began having quiet conversations in the woods during rare moments of unsupervised time, discussions that started abstractly but gradually became more specific, more focused on particular people and particular possibilities. The arrival of Margaret Blackwell in November 1849 added an unexpected variable to the carefully balanced equation of plantation life. Richard's daughter had been away for 3 years at a finishing school in Savannah, an institution where wealthy Southern girls learned the social graces expected of their class. But Margaret's education had included exposure to ideas her father would have considered dangerous and seditious. Some of her teachers, while careful to maintain outward conformity to Southern social norms, had privately introduced their students to abolitionist literature and moral philosophy that questioned the foundations of slavery. Margaret returned to the Whitmore Estate a changed person. The girl who had left at 19, accepting slavery as a natural and eternal feature of society, came back at 22 with profound doubts about the system that sustained her family's wealth. She had read Harriet Beecher Stowe's work, smuggled into her school by sympathetic educators. She had been exposed to religious arguments against slavery that contradicted the scriptural justifications her father preached. She had met people from northern states who viewed slavery not as a necessary evil, but as an absolute moral abomination that no civilized society could tolerate. These new convictions put Margaret in immediate conflict with her father and cousin. She began asking uncomfortable questions during family meals, challenging Richard's biblical justifications for slavery with alternative scriptural interpretations. She expressed discomfort with the plantation's disciplinary practices, questioning whether such brutality was truly necessary for maintaining order. She suggested that perhaps enslaved people might work more efficiently if treated with basic human dignity rather than constant threat of violence. These suggestions were received with reactions ranging from Richard's cold disapproval to Thomas's open mockery. Jacob observed Margaret's transformation with cautious interest.
He had learned long ago not to trust white people's professed sympathies, having seen too many examples of temporary moral concern that evaporated when maintaining that concern became personally costly. But Margaret's discomfort seemed genuine, and more importantly, the tension she created within the Blackwell family represented a tactical advantage. Divided attention meant reduced vigilance. Family conflict meant distracted oversight. These conditions could create opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for them. Richard decided that Margaret needed education of a different sort. Instruction in the practical realities of plantation management that would cure her of dangerous idealism. He began requiring her to accompany him on inspections, forcing her to witness the daily operations that kept the Whitmore estate profitable. More significantly, he insisted that she attend punishments, believing that watching discipline administered would help her understand its necessity. This decision would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The first punishment Margaret witnessed involved a field worker named Samuel, who had been accused of working too slowly during tobacco harvest. The accusation came from Thomas, who had been in a particularly foul mood that day and was looking for someone to take his frustration out on. Samuel was 28 years old, father of 3 young children, a man who had worked the tobacco field since childhood and knew the work as well as anyone. The charge was almost certainly fabricated, but the truth of the accusation was irrelevant to the punishment that followed. Samuel was brought to the cedar post in the workyard, while all enslaved people were assembled to watch. Henry Porter bound Samuel's hands above his head, stretching his body taut against the weathered wood. Margaret was positioned beside her father and Thomas, given a chair brought from the main house for her comfort. Richard explained in his calm, measured voice that discipline was the foundation of order, that mercy was often cruelty in disguise, that a plantation owner who flinched from necessary punishment was a plantation owner who would soon lose control of his property and his enslaved workforce. Porter administered the first lash with practiced efficiency. The leather whip cut through Samuel's shirt and into the flesh beneath, drawing a line of blood and a cry of pain that Samuel tried but failed to suppress. Margaret's face went pale, but she remained seated. The second lash landed slightly below the first, creating a parallel line of torn flesh. The third reopened the second wound, causing blood to flow more freely. By the 5th lash, Samuel's shirt was soaked with blood and his screams had become hoarse and desperate. Margaret lasted until the 7th lash before her body rebelled against what her eyes were witnessing. She vomited violently, doubling over in her chair while her stomach expelled its contents onto the dirt of the workyard. Richard's response was not sympathy, but irritation. He gripped her daughter's arm firmly when she tried to stand and leave, forcing her to remain seated through all 20 lashes. Thomas laughed at his cousin's distress, making comments about female weakness and suggesting that perhaps Margaret wasn't truly a Blackwell if she couldn't stomach a simple disciplinary session. Jacob watched this scene from his position in the assembled crowd, and something clicked into place in his mind. Margaret's reaction was genuine horror.
Not performative sympathy. More importantly, her public humiliation in front of the enslaved community created a strange inversion of the usual power dynamics. She had been reduced to helplessness, had lost control of her own body, had been forced to continue witnessing something that violated her moral sensibilities. In that moment, despite the vast difference in their legal and social positions, Margaret had experienced a tiny fraction of the powerlessness that defined enslaved existence. Over the following weeks, Richard intensified his campaign to harden his daughter's sensibilities.
He required Margaret to accompany Henry Porter on daily inspection rounds, exposing her to the constant low-level brutality that sustained plantation operations. She saw children as young as 6, working in tobacco fields under the burning sun. She witnessed a pregnant woman forced to continue heavy labor until the day she went into premature delivery. She heard the casual cruelty and how white overseers and workers discussed enslaved people, as if they were livestock rather than human beings with thoughts and feelings and souls. Each experience strengthened, rather than weakened, Margaret's convictions. She began asking more pointed questions, no longer satisfied with her father's evasions and justifications. She discovered through careful questioning of house servants that Drake had regularly sexually abused young women on the plantation, that his death had been celebrated quietly among the enslaved community, that such abuse continued in more subtle forms under the current regime. These revelations horrified her and created in her a determination to find ways to alleviate suffering, even if she couldn't yet imagine how to challenge the entire system. The tension within the Blackwell family reached a breaking point in early December, when Margaret attempted to intervene during a punishment. A young woman named Grace had been accused of breaking a valuable piece of china in the main house dining room. Thomas had ordered 10 lashes as punishment. When Porter raised his whip for the first strike, Margaret stood abruptly from her chair and shouted for him to stop. Her voice carried an authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. The confrontation that followed played out in front of the entire enslaved community. Thomas was furious at his cousin's interference, shouting that she was undermining plantation discipline and encouraging defiance. Richard supported his nephew, declaring that Margaret had lost all perspective and was becoming a danger to the family's interests. Margaret responded by calling them both monsters and saying that if this was what it meant to be a Blackwell, then she wanted no part of the family legacy. She refused to witness any more punishments, refused to participate in plantation management, and threatened to write letters to relatives in Savannah describing the atrocities she had witnessed. The family argument continued in the main house for hours, voices audible even in the slave quarters. Thomas suggested that Margaret should be sent to an asylum for hysterical women, a threat that carried real weight given that families often institutionalized daughters who became inconveniently moral or independent. Richard was more measured, but equally determined to regain control over his daughter's behavior. He forbade her from leaving the estate, restricted her access to writing materials, and assigned a house servant to monitor her movements and report any concerning behavior. Jacob realized that this family chaos created the exact conditions he had been waiting years to exploit. Richard and Thomas were distracted, their attention focused on managing Margaret rather than on plantation security or routine operations. The annual trip to Augusta was approaching, a journey that would take them away from the estate for several days. The winter weather had turned harsh, with temperatures dropping well below freezing at night and ice forming on standing water. These conditions would be strategically useful in ways Jacob had been mentally rehearsing for months. Daniel had noticed the same opportunities. During a brief conversation near the tobacco curing barns, speaking in voices barely above whispers, the two men acknowledged, without stating explicitly, that the moment they had been preparing for was approaching. No specific plans were discussed yet. Both men understood that such conversations needed to happen in absolute privacy, with no possibility of being overheard. But the understanding passed between them clearly. Soon, very soon, they would act. The preparations Jacob made in those final weeks before Richard and Thomas's departure for Augusta were subtle enough to avoid notice. He borrowed small items from various locations around the plantation, things that wouldn't be missed immediately. a coil of rope from the equipment shed, a tarp from the tobacco barns, kitchen knives that he cleaned and returned before anyone noticed their absence, having made note of their sharpness and balance. He walked the road to Augusta multiple times under various pretexts, memorizing every curve and landmark, identifying the perfect location for what he had in mind. The hounds received special attention during this period. Jacob adjusted their feeding schedule slightly, giving them a bit less food than usual, so they would be hungrier than normal, but not so hungry as to be difficult to control. He spent extra time exercising them, building their stamina, while also reinforcing his control over their behavior through the training techniques he had perfected over years. The dogs trusted him completely by this point, responding to his commands with immediate obedience, treating him as the pack leader in ways they never responded to their nominal owners. Most importantly, Jacob maintained his facade of total normalcy. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his eyes downcast, performed every task with his usual efficiency. Nothing in his behavior suggested that he was anything other than the obedient, simple-minded slave that Richard Blackwell believed him to be. This was perhaps Jacob's greatest skill, the ability to hide his true self so completely that even people who interacted with him daily had no sense of the intelligence, the rage, the carefully constructed plan that existed beneath the submissive surface he presented to the world. On the night before Richard and Thomas's scheduled departure for Augusta, Jacob lay awake in his cabin reviewing every detail of what would happen the next day. He thought about Ruth, sold away to Mississippi, carrying another man's child. He thought about his mother Leah, who had died because her spirit had been broken beyond repair. He thought about every humiliation he had witnessed, every injustice he had been forced to accept, every moment when he had stood silent while others suffered. Tomorrow, all that silence would find its voice. Tomorrow,
the careful plan he had been constructing for years would finally be executed. Tomorrow, Richard Blackwell and Thomas Blackwell would learn that the man they thought of as property, as a simple tool for managing their hounds, was in fact something far more dangerous. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. The morning of December 18th arrived with temperatures well below freezing, the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned the ground hard as stone. Richard Blackwell emerged from the main house at dawn, dressed in his traveling clothes and carrying a leather case filled with tobacco samples and commercial documents. Thomas followed minutes later, looking haggard from the previous night's drinking, but functional enough for the journey ahead. The carriage had been prepared the evening before, loaded with supplies for the multi-day trip to Augusta, where Richard would conduct his annual business with tobacco buyers and merchants. Jacob was already at the kennels when the sun rose, going through his normal morning routine of feeding and exercising the hounds. He moved with his usual efficiency, showing no sign that this day was different from any other. Everything depended on perfect execution. A single mistake would mean not just failure, but likely death, probably not just for him, but for others who would be punished collectively for his individual action. Daniel had positioned himself near the tobacco barns that morning, ostensibly preparing equipment for winter storage, but actually waiting for Jacob's signal. The two men had discussed their plan in whispered fragments over the previous days, never speaking openly about specifics, but understanding each other through careful inference and shared determination. His role would be critical, but also dangerous, requiring him to act with speed and precision once the moment arrived. Richard and Thomas departed the Whitmore Estate mid-morning, later than planned due to some last-minute business Richard needed to attend to regarding a shipment of cured tobacco.
Margaret watched from an upstairs window as the carriage rolled down the long drive, her feelings about her father and cousin's departure complex and conflicted. She was relieved to have them gone, but she also felt annoying anxiety about what their absence might mean. Jacob had left the plantation an hour before the carriage's departure, moving through the forest on paths that only someone with years of intimate knowledge of the property would know existed. He carried with him a canvas bag containing the tools he would need: rope, a heavy axe borrowed from the woodshed, the sharpest of the kitchen knives he had tested days earlier, and most critically, a rusted bear trap he had discovered months ago in an abandoned storage shed at the far edge of the property. Daniel followed a different route through the woods, approaching the ambush point from the opposite direction. Both men moved with the careful silence of experienced hunters, placing each foot deliberately to avoid snapping branches or rustling leaves that might alert anyone to their presence. Discovery at this stage would mean immediate execution without trial or question. The ambush point Jacob had selected was 2 miles from the estate, where the forest grew dense on both sides. A fallen tree forced the carriage to slow significantly to navigate around it. The ravine provided both concealment and a convenient location for disposing of evidence afterward. Jacob positioned the bear trap with meticulous care, placing it where the carriage wheels would need to pass. He covered it with leaves and small branches, creating camouflage that looked natural but would not prevent the trap from functioning. The sound of the approaching carriage reached Jacob's ears long before the vehicle came into view. Jacob pressed himself flat against the earth behind the thick trunk of a fallen log, becoming one with the forest floor, invisible to anyone passing by. His breathing slowed deliberately, forcing his body into a state of controlled calm. The carriage rounded the bend and approached the fallen tree, slowing as expected. The front wheel rolled over the concealed trap. The mechanism engaged with a metallic snap that echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The trap's jaws closed on the wooden wheel with devastating force, splintering the wood and causing the entire carriage to lurch violently sideways. The horses reared in panic. Thomas was thrown from his seat by the sudden impact, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Richard managed to grip the side rail and avoid being thrown completely, but was left off balance and disoriented. Before either man could fully comprehend what had happened, Jacob and Daniel emerged from their hiding spots with coordinated precision. Jacob reached Thomas first, bringing the axe handle down on the younger man's head with calculated force. The blow was intended to stun, to incapacitate. Thomas collapsed, blood flowing from a gash on his scalp, consciousness flickering. Daniel was already moving toward Richard with the rope. Richard had managed to extract a small pistol from his coat pocket. He raised it toward Jacob with shaking hands, his face showing not fear, but outrage that his property would dare attack him. The pistol fired, but Richard's aim was compromised. The ball passed harmlessly through empty air. Before Richard could reload, Daniel was on him. The rope went around Richard's neck with practiced efficiency, the slipknot tightening as Daniel pulled with all his strength. Richard dropped the pistol and clawed at the rope, his face purpling as air was cut off. The struggle lasted less than a minute before consciousness fled. Jacob secured Thomas with additional rope while the younger man was still dazed. His eyes focused gradually, awareness returning along with the horrifying realization of his situation. He tried to speak, but Jacob gagged him effectively. Richard regained consciousness to find himself bound and helpless, lying on the frozen ground with his own slave standing over him. The expression on Richard's face cycled through disbelief, fury, and finally something approaching fear as he understood the extent of his miscalculation. He had thought Jacob simple, obedient, trustworthy. He had never imagined that the quiet slave who cared for his hounds was cataloging every injustice, planning methodically,
waiting with patience that exceeded Richard's capacity to understand.
Execution was not quick. Jacob had waited too long and endured too much to allow these men the mercy of a swift death. What happened next in that frozen forest was brutal beyond description, a settling of accounts that involved neither mercy nor hesitation. The cold weather slowed blood loss, prolonging the process in ways that would have been impossible in summer heat. The disposal of the bodies required immediate action. Jacob and Daniel used the knives to begin the grim process of dismemberment, reducing the corpses to pieces that could be transported more easily. The work was crude and brutal, guided by practical necessity. They worked in near silence, focused entirely on the task at hand. The carriage horses had calmed somewhat once the violence ended. Jacob approached them carefully, speaking in soothing tones, reassuring the animals. He unhitched them from the damaged carriage and led them into the forest where he secured them to trees. The horses would be found eventually, but without the carriage or its occupants, creating confusion about what exactly had happened. The carriage itself required destruction to eliminate it as evidence. Jacob and Daniel used the axe to smash it into smaller pieces, breaking apart the wooden frame and scattering the fragments through the forest in multiple directions. Some pieces were thrown into the ravine, others buried under leaf litter, still others carried several hundred yards away and hidden. The work took hours. Richard and Thomas's clothing and personal belongings received similar treatment. Documents were torn into small pieces and scattered. Richard's watch was buried in one location, Thomas's pistol in another. Their boots were separated and hidden in different spots. Nothing was left intact. Nothing was left together. The remains of the bodies presented the most challenging disposal problem. Jacob's plan was elegant in its horror. He knew the hounds' feeding schedule intimately, knew exactly how much they typically consumed, knew that the intense cold would preserve meat for several days. The plan was to transport the remains back to the plantation in stages, mixing them with the hounds' regular food over the next few days. They worked through the afternoon and into early evening, using the tarp to transport the first load of remains through the forest to the plantation. By the time darkness fell, the ambush site had been transformed. The bear trap was retrieved. The blood-soaked earth was covered with fresh soil and then disguised with leaves and forest debris. Jacob and Daniel returned to the plantation separately, arriving at different times to avoid any appearance of coordination. Jacob went immediately to the kennels where he began his evening routine of feeding the hounds, mixing small portions of human flesh with their regular food. The dogs consumed everything eagerly. They showed no behavioral difference that would alert anyone to the unusual nature of their meal. Over the next 3 days, Jacob continued feeding the hounds portions of human remains mixed with their regular food. The cold weather was holding, keeping the meat from spoiling. No one questioned the hounds' feeding schedule or inspected their meals closely. Jacob was trusted completely in his role as kennel keeper. The remaining fragments that could not be fed to the hounds were buried in various locations around the plantation. Small bones went into the swampy area where the enslaved were buried. Larger bones were buried near the ravine where the murders had occurred. By December 21st, all physical evidence had been eliminated or dispersed beyond reconstruction. Margaret began expressing concern on the 23rd. She questioned Henry Porter about communication from Richard. Porter had received nothing and shared her growing alarm. The enslaved community maintained absolute silence. No one had seen Jacob or Daniel do anything unusual. The collective quiet emerged from shared understanding that whatever had happened was something they had no interest in helping to solve. Jacob continued his routines with meticulous attention to appearances. Internally, he felt a calmness he had not experienced since childhood. On Christmas Day, Porter traveled to Preston to alert local authorities. Jacob stood at the kennels that evening, watching the hounds settle in. They had no idea of their role, but Jacob saw them as unwitting accomplices in justice, instruments turned against those who had believed themselves untouchable. Sheriff William Crawford arrived at the Whitmore Estate on December 26th with 2 deputies and a tracker named Silas Morton. Crawford was 50 years old, weathered by decades of frontier justice, known for his methodical approach to investigations. His presence created immediate tension throughout the property, affecting enslaved and free alike. The investigation began with detailed questioning of Margaret, Henry Porter, and white employees. Crawford wanted precise timelines, unusual behaviors, any indication the missing men might have altered their plans. Margaret described the family tensions preceding the departure, but insisted her father would never disappear without communication. Porter confirmed Richard's meticulous nature made the silence incomprehensible. Silas Morton began tracking the Augusta road, searching for signs of passage or trouble. Rain had fallen twice since the disappearance, complicating his work considerably. He found carriage wheel impressions near the plantation, but they faded quickly. 2 miles out, where forest grew thickest, Morton discovered something that transformed the investigation entirely. The earth showed signs of violent disturbance. Branches were broken on nearby trees. Dark stains marked the frozen ground that looked unmistakably like blood. Most telling were fragments of rusted metal partially buried in leaves, pieces that appeared to come from an old trap mechanism. Fabric scraps caught on bushes matched descriptions of Richard's traveling coat. Crawford ordered an expanded search, mobilizing men from neighboring properties. Over 2 days, the forest yielded disturbing evidence. More clothing fragments appeared scattered through the woods, many blood-stained. Pieces of the destroyed carriage were found in a ravine, deliberately smashed and hidden. Most horrifying were bone fragments discovered in multiple locations, some showing crude cutting marks consistent with dismemberment. The bones created a puzzle that baffled investigators. They were scattered across a wide area, many of the smaller pieces completely missing. The local doctor examined what had been recovered and declared them likely human, though the crude dismemberment made certainty difficult. The pattern suggested someone with basic butchering knowledge but no anatomical expertise. Crawford turned his attention to the enslaved community, suspecting conspiracy. He interrogated each person about relationships, possible motives, knowledge that the missing men might have made enemies. Everyone insisted ignorance about what happened and denied any interest in harming the master.
Escape plans. The responses were uniformly evasive. Each person denied knowing anything, seeing anything suspicious, or understanding who might have committed such violence. Jacob was questioned multiple times due to his access and mobility as kennel keeper. Crawford noted his nervousness, the way his hands trembled slightly during interrogation. But Jacob's story remained consistent. He had fed the hounds normally, noticed nothing unusual, spent the day of the disappearance performing routine tasks. Other enslaved people confirmed seeing him at the kennels throughout the relevant period. The search eventually reached the kennels themselves, where investigators made a discovery that provided the final piece of the horrifying puzzle. Buried shallowly in the earth around the dog enclosures were small bone fragments that appeared disturbingly human. The doctor examined them and could not rule out that they were remains from Richard and Thomas Blackwell. Crawford understood immediately what had happened, though proving it was another matter entirely. Someone had used the plantation's own tracking hounds to dispose of evidence, feeding them the dismembered remains of their masters. The coldness of this method, the intimate knowledge required, pointed directly toward the kennel keeper. Jacob was arrested on January 2nd and held for questioning. Without direct evidence linking him to the murders, without witnesses willing to testify, Crawford had only circumstantial connections. The blood on Jacob's clothing was explained by animal slaughter. His presence on the plantation was confirmed by multiple witnesses. The collective silence of the enslaved community formed an impenetrable wall. Daniel was also detained after investigators noticed his unusual friendship with Jacob, but he maintained complete denial of any involvement. The two men never wavered in their stories, never contradicted each other, never showed the kind of nervous inconsistency that might have provided leverage for prosecutors.
On the night of January 15th, both Jacob and Daniel vanished from the makeshift holding area where they were being kept. The escape was clearly aided by others, though no one would admit to seeing anything or helping in any way. Crawford issued wanted notices throughout Georgia and neighboring states, but knew the chances of recapture were minimal. Margaret made a decision that scandalized Talbot County society. On January 20th, she signed documents freeing all 28 enslaved people on the Whitmore Estate, citing her horror at the system that had created such violence. The decision destroyed the plantation's economic value and ended the Blackwell presence in the region. The case remained officially unsolved. Crawford retired years later, still convinced of Jacob's guilt, but unable to prove it. The truth was buried by collective silence, protected by people who understood that sometimes justice operates outside legal structures, that sometimes the oppressed must become their own judges and executioners.